let's talk about British fantasy fiction, particularly how it's different. Particularly, really practically, I mean how it's different to American fantasy fiction, which is so much of what we talk about on BookTube. Fantasy fiction from an American cultural background with all the variety that may imply. And I think it's easy for us to determine there is some difference between the British fantasy and American fantasy mindsets, if not the fiction, by looking at covers. For instance, here is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. Here's the American cover by Michael Whelan, this full fantasy art, high style, I guess it's digital oils with Kaladin on the front and then Zeth on the back. And here is the British cover. It's much more minimalistic, isn't it? Much more stylized with the bright colour contrasts and relative lack of features. Why is there a difference there? And you can see that across a lot of covers. You can see that not always, but British fantasy covers are often quite stylized, often quite minimalistic. And when they're not minimalistic, they are not necessarily like Michael Whelan. I think less of Michael Whelan, more of Josh Kirby for full colour paintings. Look at that, the stereotyped features and the over-exaggerated physical movements and the bright colours on his Discworld covers. There's a difference somehow that means that British fantasy buyers connected different tropes in their covers to American fantasy buyers. And I think this can be connected quite reasonably, I think, to the fiction itself. I think there's such a thing as a British fantasy style. Not every British writer equally writes in that style, if you want to put it that way. But I think it is a real thing, and I think it's something which we can probably all intuitively recognise. There's family resemblances. So, for instance, if we talk about American authors, look, N.K. Jemisin and Robert Jordan are very different authors. They have very different concerns, incredibly different styles. But there are things that I, as a Brit, can see as connecting them because in a way that isn't readily accessible to me or readily equivalent to me and my backgrounds, even though they're such vastly different authors in an enormously culturally variable nation and culture. And I think the same can be said of British authors, that Terry Pratchett, David Gemmell, Susan Cooper, Robert Holdstock, they're identifiably from the same family, even though they're very different authors. So what makes up that family resemblance? What are the, some families have lots of red hair, don't they? Some families are very freckly. Some families are naturally quite short. Whatever, the family resemblance. What is the family resemblance in British fiction that allows us to distinguish it? I want to talk about the distinctives of the British family tradition, the fantasy tradition, rather. But I need to offer a caveat because someone out there is wondering. Of course, there is no hermetically sealed cultural bubble. There's just British authors, just American authors. They're completely different. They've never heard of each other. There's always been interplay between the literary traditions since America emerged out of the British Empire. Obviously, Tolkien was a great influence on Stephen King, Stephen Donaldson, Robert Jordan, the entire grand fantasy tradition of modern American fantasy. And of course, Fritz Leiber influenced Terry Pratchett, and Louis L'Amour influenced David Gemmell. It's not as if the two are disconnected, so I don't want to give that impression. But I'm saying nonetheless that no matter the slight changes in the gene pool, there's a general set of family traits. Here's my general thrust. There are broad, coherent family groups, and you wouldn't get a Sanderson or a Martin coming out of Britain. You wouldn't get a Pratchett or a Holdstock or a Douglas Adams or whoever coming out of the USA. And the evidence for this is, as I say, I think obvious to anyone reading these authors whose different styles emerge and are popular. So I'm going to suggest 4 distinctives. And not every British fantasy author who I'm identifying has all of these, but archetypally British fantasy will touch on multiple of these areas. So the first is source material. There are classic source materials for British fantasy. For instance, one is fairy, the idea that there is somehow a realm in the wood which we can access, but which has different rules, which involves often quite dangerous, capricious creatures. That's something which I think is very much a British fantasy styling, not that all elves ever have been, but certainly compared to more European continental traditions of folklore, the the small folk in the woods who are strange and dangerous is very endemic in the British Isles. And say, look, the Mythico Wood Cycle by Robert Holstock has magical woods. Neil Gaiman, I've got his Neverwhere here, which definitely does have a fairy influence as well, though it's not really a fairy book. But yeah, Neil Gaiman's Stardust is set in fairy. And Mirror Mask by him is a fairy-like world. And Neverwhere, as I say, is influenced by that too. Elidor by Alan Garner and others of Alan Garner's works. And Strange and Norel by Susanna Clarke. Those are all things influenced by fairy, which is a British folkway in a way, in its own right. Another influence is the Arthuriad, the legend and matter of Logres. So this sort of Celto-Saxo-Romano-British melange pre-late Saxon Norman period. The idea that there were heroes in the Dark Ages who held back the darkness, maybe particularly including the Saxons. And this is a really important, and Logres as a description of Arthur's kingdom, really important source, I think, of British style fantasy, that there are often implicit or explicit references in that direction. You could, by the way, I'd say, the Lord of the Rings even, with the idea of the once and future king, the king who, the family of kings who disappeared who return. That's a strongly Arthurian sort of influence. But more explicitly, the Dark is Rising sequence, for instance, or the Planets trilogy, the Space trilogy by C.S. Lewis, particularly that hideous Strength, the third of the trilogy. That's science fantasy, really. It's a crossover between the two. But these are things which explicitly talk about Logres. Taliesin through Logres, the poems by Charles Williams. The idea that there is somehow a secret side identity to Britain through which and from which the legends that these writers are writing about comes. That's something which I think is distinctive of British fantasy. Folk stories, and by that I mean British folk stories, and the idea that folk stories are determinative of the stories we can tell at some level, is incredibly prevalent. Rather than saying, oh, I'm going to create this incredibly detailed new world, a sort of Rochar for Brandon Sanderson, Cosmere for Brandon Sanderson, rather than, or a Robert Jordan type creation. As incredibly impressive as those things are, that's not a route that many British authors comparatively have gone down. Some have, but not many. Rather, you get this straight, even again, Middle-earth is a legend of the British Isles. It's intentionally meant to be the kind of great legendarium of Britain. And so you've got Mythico Wood, which I've shown already. Here's, as I say, Levondis, the second in that cycle, which is based on the idea of folk stories being almost stored magically in oak trees. Narnia is the idea, is full of British folklore tropes. It has all its satires and its brownies and its dwarves, but all in this very British mode rather than in a more continental mode. The Dark is Rising trilogy sequence, again, as I said, is Arthurian, but it's also full of the third book is The Green Witch, about a Wicca-like figure being pushed off a cliff as part of a once-a-year nighttime ceremony by the women of the village. It's very much a folklore image that is then woven into the fantasy. Harry Potter, Lord Dunsany, George MacDonald. Those are all stories or authors who rely heavily on folklore. But here's an interesting one. British medieval history is not a serious source of British fantasy for British fantasy authors of this style. It is for Tad Williams and George R.R. Martin, American authors, but there's very few British authors who heavily turn to their own history in terms of that sort of kings and knights period of recorded history. They're much more likely to go back to the Arthuriad. Second distinctive, the first distinction was the source material of British fantasy. The second is subgenre. Ironically, there is very little epic fantasy of the Robert Jordan Brandon Sanderson type in British fantasy outside of Tolkien. There is some, certainly, but comparatively very little. Rather, you depend on other formats. The school story or the child detective story, that's a very common one. And by that, the school story is typically boarding school, Billy Bunter, Mallory Towers. Just William kind of has a touch of it, though very rarely in school itself. But the kids at school getting themselves in trouble and hijinks. And again, the child detective one, for instance, the Dark is Rising trilogy goes down that line, doesn't it? But the famous five, most famously. and other Enid Blyton books, though there are some other examples. The 5 children in it are kind of child detectives, the Samiad trilogy characters. And in fantasy, you have a lot of that school story, The Worst Witch, Harry Potter, and the child detective related genre. So the Dark is Rising trilogy sequence is often a child detective kind of series. Elidor by Alan Garner, which I've already mentioned. Harry Potter is also child detective as well as school story. It merges the two quite naturally because they are closely related. The portal fantasy is incredibly common in British fantasy. Outside, and I don't mean just in YA middle grade where you might expect them, but all over the place. Mythigo Wood, Lord Dunsany, Narnia, Elidor, Peter Pan. All of these things are where you transition across a boundary and Neil Gaiman explicitly does that in cases like Stardust. You transition across a boundary into another world, and that's something which, as I say, is not just a YA middle grade trope, but it's something common across one subsection of British fantasy. Finally, a particularly important kind of British fantasy subgenre is not really a common, not one you'd say elsewhere. It's more a theme, perhaps, but national self-reflection. The Space Trilogy, Dark is Rising, and the Elric stories by Michael Moorcock. These are all things at some level thinking about and dealing with Britain. And that's not to say that other national fictions do not do that. Of course they do, in more explicit or less explicit ways. But I'm saying that the British fantasy sub-style is very reflective on its own cultural origins in a way that you don't go to some of the great series, your Robert Jordan Wheel of Time to get that, but it's incredibly common in very high quality British fantasy for that to be a theme. In the American context, you might look, I suppose, at The Stand or the N.K. Jemisin trilogy, the Broken Earth trilogy. I think those are places where you can see some degree of explicit or implicit reflection upon America. But yeah, as I say, that's one typical subgenre, strong theme, framing device in the British fantasy style. The third distinctive, the tone, and in a way, this is the thing that I most think of when I think of British fantasy stylings, that there is a tonal difference between it and other Anglophone fictions. It's hard to sum up except by saying that it's weird, it's sometimes dreamlike, it's sometimes arch and dry, it's always slightly detached, it's slightly sideways, it's not very often direct and impassioned in the way that you might expect from some of our other favourite authors. There are whole passages of Lavondis, for instance, or The Dark is Rising, the book itself, which are frankly like fairy fever dreams. They're baffling. I was reading bits of Lavondis and just thinking, look at the cover, you can tell there's something weird going on, can't you? But the whole thing's just like, okay, now that's happening, okay, what's going on? And you're just caught up in this strange, poetic, rhythmic, dreamlike sequence. Again, Elidor, or That Hideous Strength, the descent of the planets in that hideous strength is a marvellous example of that, I think. Moorcock and Tolkien, again, though ironically Moorcock hates Tolkien, they both managed to combine this slightly dreamlike and detached style with a higher epic, mythic style, which resembles, I suppose when you read them, it resembles some of the books of myths and legends I read when I was young and I still read now. Pratchett and Gaiman, Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, they press on to the lighter Archer style, but it's the same style. It's not different, it's the same style. It's a not wholly real style, a not wholly straightforward thing. If you read, particularly Neil Gaiman's short stories, are a very good example of that, how often he has a sort of intentionally detached style. And the final distinctive is less important, but it is relevant. It's humour. It's rarer, but it is relevant. Michael Moorcock, Jasper Fforde, Terry Pratchett, Neil Gaiman, J.K. Rowling to a degree, they all mix the classic British sense of humour, dry, ironic, angular. They mix that into their fantasy. It's something where the British sensibility, which often is dry, ironic, angular, is somehow embedded in the texture of the story. So those are the four factors I've tried to identify in what I'm calling the British fantasy style. I'm saying source material, subgenre choice, or tonal style, both the kind of the writing style itself and the atmosphere brought up, and the humour. Those are the four things I think are distinctive about the British fantasy style. What are your favourite British fantasy series? Do you agree that I've identified something about British fantasy that's useful? Are there other traits or elements that you think define the British fantasy style? What about the American fantasy style or the Canadian fantasy style or whatever fantasy style you are most familiar with? I think that'd be a really interesting conversation to talk about the way in which both metacultures and subcultures produce different types of fiction. And that's something, I'd love to hear more about that in general, and maybe I should talk more about that in general. But anyway, put that kind of stuff down in the comments. I'd really like to hear about it and talk about it with you. Until next time.